Hey friend, thank you for sharing this painting for a critique and reaching out for help about transforming this basic impressionist study into a more finished work of art. Your digital study on the left here is a very nice simplification of the painting on the right. And I'll see if I can demonstrate how you can take this painting further. So I'll be doing a little painting demo later in this video. And you said that I think I'm able to establish basic shapes and values, and I agree, you are, but I'm struggling to add details and hard edges. The work suddenly falls apart. Each time I come to this stage in my work, I don't know what steps to do next. And this is a great problem to wrestle with because there's a tension between simplicity and specificity. And we'll be talking a lot about that in this critique. As artists, we need to master simplicity, the ability to simplify a painting from many pieces into just a few pieces, because the true mark of a master is not in how complicated they make a painting, it's in how simple they make it seem. Many artists get tripped up when they paint portraits because they think that they're painting a face. They become overwhelmed with the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the eyebrows. The list just never ends. But if you can simplify anything that you see, including a face, into just values, edges, and color, then it becomes much more manageable. And you've done a great job of simplifying this painting. Your painting has less values, less colors, less brush strokes compared to the reference. And yet the overall impression is still very solid. So talking about this overall impression, as I zoom out, we have a very solid impression of form. We can see the three dimensions of this piece emerging. Up close, we see that this is really a simple study with just a few brushstrokes, but it strengthens from a distance. And that tells us that the impression is very strong. And you've done a very nice job with that. Which does not come easy to a lot of artists. But to take this painting further, you need to be specific. And I'm not talking about details, I'm talking about being more specific with your values, edges, and colors. Now, the Impressionists were known for their ability to simplify, right? If we look in on this painting, we see it has less strokes, bold, confident strokes, simplifying an area, and yet it looks so real and believable. This is a painting done by Sargent. Even these birds off in the distance, we have a strong impression of them, even of this bird just landing on the water. It looks and feels believable, even though it's not necessarily fully realistic. And so the Impressionists were known for their ability to simplify, but I would argue that it was their level of specificity that made them great. And I feel like there's a common misconception that Impressionism is an easier, more carefree style of painting than realism. And they certainly appear to be that way. We have, there's this emotion that's created in a painting like this. And perhaps in some ways, this was painted with a carefree attitude. But their greatness certainly wasn't on account of laziness or aimlessness. The Impressionists were classically trained, and it wasn't that they couldn't paint realism and then just stopped halfway. They demonstrated an even greater mastery over realism by simplifying it further and yet still creating a believable impression. So their marks are not haphazard. Their marks were specific. They knew that when they put down a stroke, the color and value was so perfect and the pressure on the brush was so specific that it would suffice for the 10 strokes that it would take for a realist painter to make it look believable. And that's not ambiguity, that's specificity. Looking at this painting here, you can see how loose, how carefree the brushstrokes in the foliage are. But look at how sharp, look at how specific, how bold, how clear, clean the edges on the pillars are. Without those definitive, specific marks, if those pillars were fuzzy, if they were careless, if they weren't specific, this whole painting would fall apart. Now, I see a lot of artists who are really good at being specific, but they struggle to simplify. They paint meticulous details, and yet when you step back from their work, it falls terribly flat. But in your case, you're like in the opposite category. You've captured the impression, but it's an ambiguous impression. It's afraid of commitment. It lacks intentionality. And that may sound harsh, but you're actually in a really good place, because I think simplifying is actually the harder of those two things. And you just need to learn how to be more specific. And that's going to come when you have a process that you can make decisions based on a more clear understanding that when you define a stroke, you know that it's going to have a certain effect. And so that's what we'll be focusing on. But I'm excited because a lot of my critiques are focused on that simplifying aspect, but this is the specific side of it. And yeah, it's gonna be cool. Okay, so let's start really getting into this. Simplifying these things with specificity. That's gonna be the goal. Now, your values and your colors, you're simplifying quite well with specificity. So I'm actually going to skirt around those. We might come back to them later as we get more into a refined painting. But what your painting needs right now is more specific edges. Simplifying your edges with specificity. We can simplify edges into two basic forms, sharp and soft. There's other kinds of edges, getting into texture, broken edges, things like that, but we're just gonna talk about these two because it's the most simple form. And the question that we need to address here is simply, how do we know which edges should be sharp and which edges should be soft? And of course, there's many ways to make a soft edge, and there's edges that can be in between sharp and soft, but we're just simplifying it. Now, there are two primary factors to consider here with edges: form and depth. So form being how to make something look round and three-dimensional, and depth being how to really kind of, push things back, pull things forward, create a nice sense of depth. So those are the two kind of lenses, the two factors we need to think about in choosing when to make an edge sharp or soft. So we'll first talk about simplifying edges for form. So bringing you into this 3D software, we can more easily see the different kinds of edges that we have. We have edges of the outer object of things. So this is an edge between the back side of the cylinder and the background. Similarly, we have this right side of the cylinder up against the floor off in the distance, and we have this same edge at the end of the object that's right up against this kind of little floor here. And so these are kind of just basic edges that are really showing just where the edge ends. And of course, those are pretty straightforward. And we have also edges between light and shadow. We've got this edge in here. We do have these small edges, but these are really just showing the slight changes in the turning. So I can ignore those. We have, again, this edge actually is an edge between light and shadow. So we have that there. So these are both edges between light and shadow. This is another one, an edge between the light and shadow. And so is this one in here. And we have edges here. All of these are edges between the light and shadow that are really, on the same object. But they're edges that are being created by the light and shadow. So among these edges between light and shadow, you have two different kinds: form shadows and cast shadows. Now, cast shadows are a little bit easier to grasp, so I will show them to you first. And if I move my screen around, we can start to see. So we've got a light source that's up there, and we have this, one side of the cylinder is lit and the other side is put into shadow. And the cylinder is actually casting a shadow onto the floor, which is why we see a silhouette of the cylinder out in here. And this sphere is actually bumping, it's in the way, and so the cast shadow is actually being shown on the sphere right there. So this cast shadow could look something like this from this angle. And of course, if we go into the direction of the light, we'll actually generally be able to completely cover that cast shadow. And you can see how the light is mostly hitting, this side, and it's still hitting all of this part of the cylinder, and then eventually it just drops off. And so we see that reflected on the floor over here, where we have all this light, and then suddenly it just drops into shadow because it's the end of the object and right where the light and shadow meets. Okay, we're kind of turned around upside down. Now there's a different kind of edge, which is called a form shadow edge. And that's happening right here and right here. And these edges are being created where the object itself is turning away from the light. The form is turning away from the light. And as it's turning away, whether it's abruptly, or in this case, if it's more round or softly turning, we have less and less light able to touch the different sides of the cylinder until it completely drops off. Similarly, on the sphere, which might be even easier to see, we have a lot of light here, and then slowly less and less light. You can see these little cubes. There's less and less light as they eventually finally drop off. So while the cast shadows is going from all the light over here into none of the light, this is slowly dropping off. The light is basically traveling in straight lines, and so it's the object itself that's turning away to create that drop off in form. So if it helps, you can almost imagine that there's 100% of the light from the light source shining around here, and then maybe it gets to about 60% by the time it's getting over here. It's bouncing off, and it's not able to enter into our eyes from this angle quite as well, and so it's dropping off, it's turning away. There's less of the light is able to touch it. Maybe it gets down to 30% over here until finally it gets to 0%. And so it's a natural gradient that's being formed. Whereas because the cast shadow is simply the end of the object, we have 100% of the light bumping up against 0% of the light, because the sphere is directly blocking the light that would otherwise be shining on this table. And once again, just to really reinforce this so that you can see these things, if you look over at this sphere over here, I'm going to turn off these light rays for a moment. We can see how this edge is nice and soft, and this edge is really sharp. And once again, we have that relationship of 100% to 80% to 50%. It's just dropping off 30% until it gets to 0. We have a little bit of reflection in here, but that's not coming directly from the light source. That's bouncing off the table and then bouncing back into here. So that's still a shadow, and we're treating it as such. But over here, we still have that 0% to 100%. And because of this abrupt jump, and because of this gradual fade, we can say that form shadows should be soft. Unless the edge is turning really abruptly, like a cube, the form shadows are going to be soft. Most form shadows in nature are going to be soft, while the cast shadows can be relatively sharp. It doesn't mean that they have to be razor sharp, but they need to be relatively sharp. So returning to this painting here, it would be really good to start defining the end of certain objects, especially ones that you want to be well defined and crisp. So if we look over at the reference image, we can see that the the edges in here, while they're in some places they can be a little bit soft, like in here or in here, we don't have the most definition. We do have enough areas where there's a clear distinction between the edges that are kind of defining and making it very visible and clear that the frills on this dress have an end, and then there's the flesh. So that's, that's pretty straightforward. But we can start defining that. Like right now, this is not defined, and it should be defined. And it may be that you are oversimplifying a little bit, being a bit ambiguous, and you don't want to commit to a certain placement, but this is the time to start to commit to a placement of something. And so, like, I see the way that you're painting with these strokes, they seem to have a certain, paint density attached to them, which I understand, but so we'll use the same one. I think you're using a round brush here, but you just firmly want to press a little bit harder and look to that edge, establishing in that color. Not too happy with that color, so let me grab something that feels a little bit more yellow, perhaps. I guess that's what I'm stuck with. But we can start defining this edge. We can fade it out a little bit as it comes. We don't want to have a line, so I'm fading downwards to blend into the rest of the frills kind of thing that we have going on here. But just by defining this edge, I'm starting to bring in some specificity. And I'm keeping it simple in the sense that I'm not worried about the other edges. For this, I'm just worried about the outer edge where it stops. And so as I zoom out, it's being a little bit more defined. And also on the other side, we have, this whole area on the flesh in here. And so maybe I can keep those a little bit more, like we just have a lot of brush work that's not helping define the edge. So if I just take, say, a color like this, pushing a little bit harder and letting this come right up against this, and I might need to switch some values at certain points. But if I can have it more clearly simplified up against that edge of the end of the object, then that should help as well. Just want to make sure that I'm just using the right values here. So just kind of cleaning these things up. I want to stay within the same, talking about values and colors, I want to stay within the same range of values and colors that you've already assigned. And that way, because the impression was solid, I can trust that if I just stay within that range and I'm very careful and thoughtful about my decisions, then they'll still hold the impression together. It's not going to fall apart. So I'm curious, why is your painting falling apart? It might be because you are forsaking all of the impression that you've captured and no longer working within the same range of colors that you were before. Also, I think this whole area is kind of, it's very blue, and I don't really want it to be that blue. I think it should just kind of stay in more of a green kind of family. So just going to kind of go over some of this. So I am making some changes to the overall impression here. And I'm just going to kind of actually cover over all this, and then I'll get a brighter value that will more appropriately fit in here. And you can see I'm working with really sharp edges. I'm kind of defining things now. Now, you can work softly and it will be easier to. But in my case, as I'm just showing you these things, it's a little bit easier for me to show it to you with sharp edges so that you can see the actual changes being made. Just kind of gently, well, that's a little too strong. So being careful, being thoughtful. Bringing this in here. But you can see I'm just working within the same range of values that was already put down to start establishing some separation. Now, to give you a clearer process and way to address the specifics of your value and color decisions, I want to kind of just show you, like if you imagine this is your palette, the colors that you're using, and let's say that you have a value range in your flesh tones. Let's say there's probably a darker value somewhere that would be in your flesh tones. That would be, I'll just grab this as the darkest value. And then this would be, say, your like a shadow value. And I've already taken this bright value and put it over here. And then we want values that would go in between, maybe something like this. That would go here. We're essentially creating a string of values that get darker and darker as they go. They're even getting, you can see there's a gradient in color as well. The shadows are more green, brown, and then the lights are getting more kind of yellow, relatively speaking, from that. So we've got these values here. And what you want to do is for each specific area, you want to stay within parameters, stay within these guardrails, like in here. So we've got this bright value right in here. And that's maybe the brightest value in the painting. This one is about the same value, but then we have these values that are kind of in between, like this one in here. This value it's not brighter than this. It's actually darker, right? So it's kind of in between, it's in here. And so this value is still brighter than this. And so there's all of these relationships that you're managing. And so maybe as you're dealing with, say, an area that's like this, you stick within a certain range. You don't allow yourself to go too dark unnecessarily. So for this area, you can find, like just on this kind of, let's just look more specifically, like right here. You've got your brightest value here, and your darkest value would be something like this. So where would that be? Where would that fall? It might fall right here. It's just barely darker than this value, and it's definitely brighter than that value. So this is the darkest value that you can allow yourself to use in that area. Well, that's parameters. That's a boundary line. So you now kind of are going from here out to here. These are the values that you're allowed to use in this specific space. Now, of course, for different areas, you can change those relationships. Let's say that you're working inside of the shadows in this area in here, even including the that kind of necklace ribbon thing. So your brightest value in that space is this one right here. And your darkest value is maybe in here, which of course is darker than that. And that's your range. You stay in here. You don't allow yourself to go out here. Even if you find something that feels nice and bright, you stick with this. You can keep that simplicity, but you can get more and more nuance. Look, there's a value here, right? But there's a value between this one and this one, I'm sure, right? And it could be maybe something like this in between. So you're getting specific in these more and more refined areas. It might be that this stroke, if you make a nice big impressionistic stroke, it's just too dark, it doesn't work. But if you try this one and you make that big stroke, it's too bright, it doesn't work. And so you take your time and you get this color, and when you put that down, it just perfectly fits in the right spot. That is that perfect balance between simplicity and specificity. So just having those kinds of parameters, limiting yourself, knowing how you're going to manage your value range, and at its core, at the end of the day, if you can manage a value range that is broken down by the light and shadow. So if you have all of your shadows staying in this kind of area for the flesh tones, and then all of your lights stay in here, well, now you not only do you have that simplicity and specificity, but you have structure to go with it, which really can reinforce a much stronger illusion of form. right? And so, yeah, so thinking in terms of these parameters, these restraints. So as you look at a certain area, you can say, okay, this is my brightest value, and this down here is my darkest value in this space that I'm working in. And that, you know, these colors are relatively more kind of pale green compared to some of the redder hues in the ear. And so you're always comparing relationships specifically. Now we are eventually going to have the end of the object on the other side. So if I grab maybe this value in here, and I am going to have to, you know, kind of clip this. And yes, there might be some points where it disappears, so we can even try that. It's called lost edges, it's a little bit more advanced application. But let's say that we want some areas to be defined, like right there, and then we let there be a gradient, and then we define it quickly again, and then let things be faded away. We can do that. So here we're just bringing more definition to that little frill right there. And it might not, as I'm doing this kind of quickly, it might not look exactly like the reference image, but you can see from my changes how we are just getting more specific. The values aren't really changing. It's just some edges are getting selectively sharper. And in this case, all I'm doing is just finding the outer edges of these different objects. But as I said, there's these edges that are going to be capturing the light and the shadow that should be sharp and soft. I think I will address the neck. So let's make sense of what kind of edges we have on the neck that's helping to turn the form. So I would say, looking at the reference image, we have a cast shadow in here from the hair on the neck. Kind of comes back in there. But then this edge over here, that's a form shadow. That's turning form. And so we can give this a form edge. We're going to make that more of a gradient. But this over here is going to stay sharp. So again, we have direction. We know what needs to be relatively sharp. We know what needs to be relatively soft. So let's go ahead and do that. First, I think just to help start to pull this image together, we can start to define this necklace a little bit more. So I will start doing that. And you can see I'm actually just sticking with the value that you have. That's a little bit bold, a little too thick. I'm okay to let that be a little bit brighter than what's there in the painting, but I do want to make sure that the back side is going to be darker. And again, I just want to take a look at that reference image. So this is where it's falling into shadow. I would say actually it's falling into shadow probably around here, and it even comes back up. So again, I'm being specific now. I'm not thinking. I've simplified maybe my value for now, but in where I'm placing my strokes, I'm being specific. So that's all in shadow, so that can be darker, and I think I do need a value that's going to be a little bit darker, but still a brighter value because we're in the light. And I'll put this down in here. And let's see what's going on. So we've got this kind of comes down. I'll leave that there for now. Okay, so, but we've done that, but we still have some kind of fuzzy edges around here. So let's eliminate those. Let's make it more clear, more obvious. Maybe we want that edge to stand out. Maybe we want it to stay a little bit softer, so maybe we leave some of that there. I think especially for an area like this, we should be being really careful to not let that be ambiguous. Still want to control the values, like there's some soft edges in here. So we want to keep the gradient that's there. And it might be easier if I change my brush to something more forgiving. So something that manages paint density. I can make softer edges with that. And then on the other side as well, I can check to see, is there a cast shadow? Yes, there is a subtle cast shadow. So I'm going to leave a little bit of room for a darker value, maybe a value like this. And then with this brighter value, I'll come right up against it nice and sharp because that's a cast shadow. I know how to treat it. I know how sharp it should be. Well, I know that it should be sharp at least. So part of what's happening is I'm choosing, again, colors and values in the right spaces. I'm not deviating. I'm just pulling the same colors from the same areas. The overall impression, I'm confident, is going to stay right where it needs to stay. The cast shadow that would be in here is probably going to get really tight, but I still want to put it in because I still want to be specific, but I'm going to just make sure that it's really nice and tight. Take this value, make sure that the necklace is thick enough. And the reason why I'm making it tight is because it's really close. A lot of, if there's any pressure that's going to be on that necklace, it's going to be right there where gravity is kind of holding it up. And not all of my edges are defined, but enough are defined that I'm starting to bring this forward. And I have to be a little bit comfortable with the fact that this necklace looks and feels really dark right now. It might be that it's still too dark, or maybe the combination of the contrast and the sharp edges are making it feel a little bit funny. But as other things become more defined, we might find that it still works quite well. So I'm looking at this value, and I think that this value is an appropriate value to use for the cast shadow, which I can make nice and sharp because I can be confident that it's the right one. I'm gonna bring it up, take it across. I'm willing to change my values if necessary. Notice how I'm putting in this darker shadow in here. It actually is a better relationship between the back of the neck and the background. It's more accurate. So I'm okay to make those changes. Something along those lines, and I think this should be darker in here as well. Something like that. So now we have sharp edges all around, but we want them to be softer in some areas, but not in others. So we want, again, where the edges are blue here, we want those to be soft, and the ones that are yellow or cast, they're going to stay sharp. So I will start to gently fade this out. This is not going to be a lesson on how to make gradients. Actually, because it's not, I'm going to use the smudging tool, kind of cheat a little bit. Well, it's not really cheating, but there's probably better ways to make gradients. And here we have some things better defined. I'm beginning to notice some value differences, like the neck feels really bright compared to what we have in the painting. So I might even take some of this green color in here and push this into here a little bit more. just see a darker value, and it maybe it should be even darker, maybe something more like this. Just pushing into here is going to help round out the neck even more. Just going to darken this just a little bit. So I am making some value adjustments as I'm getting more specific. I might see some things that need to be addressed and subtly changed, and that's okay. Nothing too drastic. No changes are being too drastic here. All right, and so we have these sharp edges, and they might feel like grossly sharp, too sharp, but I'm going to stick with them for now. I'm going to stay comfortable with being uncomfortable. I'm confident that as I zoom out, I still look at how this is starting to come together now. If I turn this off, look at how we're getting a more three-dimensional image. The impression is still holding up, and we're getting more definition. I am able to soften some edges if I feel like they're a little bit too strong. I can always do that. So I'm still thinking about simplicity. I'm still trying to keep this painting simple and specific. That's the goal. So I'm okay if some of these edges feel a little bit abrupt, a little bit too much for now. There's other areas in the painting that are just not defined. So let's keep going. I could even get more specific in some of the nuances of the neck here, and it might be interesting to see that. So if I look at this, and if I'm thinking about what kind of edges we have, I would say these are pretty tough. So just looking at trying to figure out where the light source is coming from so that I understand my edges better, I see this highlight in here, I see a highlight in here as well. And so I'm inclined to believe that the light it seems to be doing something like this. In order to bounce off in the way that it is, it's mostly overhead, coming in at a slight angle where it's able to hit this area and then bounce towards us. It's also in front of the figure and shining on her so that we catch this light on her jawline as well. And then we have this darker edge in here because that area is kind of starting to recede and the plane is turning away, starting to create a form shadow. So based on all of that, I would say that this in here is a cast. It might not even be, I probably wouldn't call it even a shadow, but it's abrupt. It's a kind of a change in the plane. And so that would be like a cast edge. This would be more form. We also have cast, of course, from the ear in here as well. This area, I might not assign a cast edge because it actually seems like it's more like just the end of the skin and now the beginning of the hair instead. But we can imagine that there might be just a cast shadow just barely in there. So we have that. That's informative. That would tell me that this is a cast shadow and that this is just, these are so subtle, but these might be on the cast shadow side, whereas the gradients would be here and here on the opposite sides. All right, so this is pretty tough, and I'm not even sure if that's the most accurate assessment, but based on that, I can now start to create my edges with more confidence. So if I take this and let's say I can define a sharp edge here because I know there's a cast shadow there, and then this can come down and be more sharp in here. This, oops, wrong value. Can just grab this value, just define this edge right along here. But I want this edge to, you might not be able to see it very well, but I'm softening out the edge that's in there, in this area. softening this side up and dragging it over. So the right side is relatively sharp and the left side is relatively soft. Again, it might seem a little brazen, a little bold. I can always change it later. Here, I'm going to put a sharper edge on this side and then let the top edge, the left side, be soft. Same thing down in here. Just going to strengthen the edge and fade it out with gentle pressure. And I'm starting to create a stronger sense of form. It might be stronger than necessary. This edge is starting to jump out to me. I'm just going to darken this a little bit because that is kind of falling back in a way. This value now feels too dark. Let's see what's going on here. There's a little mark in there. And I'll have one side be soft, I think in this case. Again, this is pretty complex. Definitely the top of this is going to be soft, whereas the bottom edges I think will be a little bit softer. But let's see if we can define this a little better. We can make it sharper right along there. Starting to create some form. We also want to carry forward this darker value in the neck. I think that we can make this darker. That's also going to help turn, the neck is turning away, so it's starting to create a gradient as it's turning away from us. So I'm just managing my edges with confidence. Oh, that's a little too dark of a value, so I'm going to grab something that's more subtle. Can push this in here. I think that we have a sharp edge on the right side again. So that's too dark. Going to soften the left side. So there's kind of this relationship of soft edges. You have a sharp edge that fades into a soft edge. It's kind of one aspect of what's going on here. And I could make this much better. I'm really using the wrong tools to do this. Like here, I just soften this a lot more easily. I can soften this a lot more easily. I'm just not used to painting digitally. In here, I can start to soften some of these things. I want to keep my cast shadow edges soft, sharp, sorry. But where there's form turning away from the light, I want it to be nice and soft. So slowly, this painting is starting to feel more and more defined. Again, we'll just kind of jump back and forth between these. This edge is probably too sharp, so I will soften this down just a little bit because that jawline is not turning so abruptly that it would create such a sharp edge. I just want it to be relatively sharp. But the edge above it, where there's a shadow, I want to make sure that that's clear and clearly dark. Again, these are decisions that I get to make. Like, the knowledge is powerful. They say knowledge is power. I know that this is a shadow. I can treat it as such. I can make it dark. I can manage a nice sharp edge in here. And it's going to start to define the ear a little bit better. I think the value might be a little too bright for that area. Let me see what the value is in here. We'll kind of cover over this a little bit more. This edge is getting a little bit softer as it fades down. There is still a turn in there. Okay, now we'll need to address the ear. The ear is very, very nondescript. We have light on the ear. This is the light of the ear. This is turning back into shadow. This is definitely in shadow over here. So let's get the darker side first. That's turning away. And I'll just start to more confidently place this in here. Of course, I want to be specific about where it goes. So I'm going to zoom out. And by zooming out, I'm still forced to, like, by looking at this from a distance, I can't be super meticulous and defined like a typical realist painter. I have to look for the areas that are going to capture that overall impression. So it is good if you're painting to see things from a distance. It really can help a lot. Okay, now let's grab this warmer color, this colorful ear. The warmth of the color is going to help give it a sense of light. You can put a sharp edge on the left side because that's the end of the object, whereas the right side in this case is the form. It's the beginning of a form shadow turning away. There's a little bit of light. It may be some hair that's kind of peeking through on the other side. That might be too bright of a value. And I think that your values might be just a little bit too bright for this. As this whole face is turning away from the light. So we're going to have some brighter values maybe around the edges of this ear, but compared to the values, say, on the neck, it has to be darker. And I think that's one of the things that's throwing this off. So it's really, when you're getting specific, you're also getting specific about the relationships between the values. Like in here, we thought that the painting looked pretty solid, but this value is actually a brighter, let's see. This value in here is, okay, so it's about the same value on the neck, but that's not the case in this painting. If we take this and compare it to over here, see how much brighter it is. This is probably brighter, just barely. It's about the same. So that's very informative. So we need to be specific about the relationships, that this value cannot be brighter than this one. That's specificity. So if I turn on my painting so far, by making this darker, I can be strengthening the image. It looks funny right now because it's surrounded by other values that are brighter than it. But if I start to darken this, then maybe the impression will actually get stronger. I'm doing this pretty roughly, as you can see. But if I start to zoom out from a distance, we might be able to get a stronger impression. Now that was using a value that's over here. We've got darker values still. This is turning away. So again, thinking about that form shadow, it's turning away, it's getting darker. It's in the process of becoming a form shadow. We just can't quite see it wrapping all the way around. So I'll bring in these even darker values. They're still bright enough. So again, being specific, they're bright enough against the background, but they're darker compared to other things in the image. So now it's starting to really feel like she has a roundness to her face that's turning away. You can see this also needs to be darker in here. And maybe the background will need to be darker a little bit. to make sure that the relationship is still looking good and strong. I think that we might have a brighter value in here. So all of these things are coming about, again, because I'm being specific. I'll just keep reinforcing that. In being specific about how my values compare against each other, I'm making decisions. Like, again, how bright is this compared to the neck? Or how bright is it compared to this? I know that this is one of the brightest values on here. It's on par with the neck, so this is looking pretty good. This might be maybe brighter than necessary. I might need to bring in a brighter value here. But this value to this is a good relationship. And this value to this value, that's a good specific relationship as well. So I have these parameters and I'm sticking within those parameters. And the parameters are getting tighter and tighter as I'm getting more and more specific on the painting. Originally, I was staying within the impression that you gave me. And now as I'm getting more specific, I'm finding, oh, I can be more specific here. Oh, this needs to be corrected over here. And that is part of this journey of specificity. And my brush strokes, like I've been softening some things, but we're getting, even its own kind of texture and form. This is not realistic. This is not photorealistic. This is still very much in the realm of impressionism, but we're getting into that more area of specificity. Even, I'll kind of pause there. About to get ahead of myself, and then I'll just slow it down. So we can kind of returning to here, having a sharp edge up against this is going to help define the shape of the ear, which I could probably, might take me more time than I want to take in refining that. But it's all of these little tiny corrections that are going to bring this about. There's even, I keep looking at this, and there's a kind of a dark value in here. And it gets pretty bright really quickly. In your painting, we have this, again, nondescript value. But it's that dark value right there that kind of really reinforces the impression of an eyelash. So I'm going to put that right up against in here. Doesn't mean that it needs to be sharp, but that value needs to be there. And I'll just kind of fade it out. And look at that. Look at how it starts to define the form. Now, this edge in here is, again, turning in form away from the light, which means it gets a gradient. So I'll just wrap that over a little bit. All of this in here is turning away, so it's getting that slight turn in the form. Right along the very edge. I'm just darkening it a little bit because we're just barely seeing it, but it's turning. And we can follow the same process with the hair and all these other things. There's going to be another edge to talk about, using edges to create depth, which I will get to eventually, but I want to make sure that all my values are looking pretty good. There's a dark value in here that I feel like I have not captured well, so I'm just going to start to push that into here. Again, I think I have more room to go a little bit darker and a little bit more colorful with a lot of my values. So I'm just pushing this around confidently. I know that I'm not using I know that I'm using the right value, so as I push it around, I know I'm not jeopardizing the painting. Darkening this a little bit more. I think this whole side of the neck can just be a little bit darker. And I'm always aware of how am I affecting the painting? How am I turning form? Still want to have relatively a sharp edge on the right side of this little divot I'm making in the neck. Can use the smudging tool just to soften some of these things. And it may be that I got a little too dark over there. I'm not sure. Just checking things, like I'm finding that I think I might have to show you, I might have to change my brush. I'm finding that this area is pretty bright compared to this area now, and this area is really bright compared to this area, is how, at least how it feels. So I want to continue to just cut and sculpt and refine until it gets better and better. Maybe if I just bring this brighter value here and start to re-establish it boldly in this area. It'll start to come together more. Just fading it out with some pressure. Being bold, sharp edge right here. Again, as I talked about that cast shadow earlier. This really kind of goes all the way down to here. Gonna do gentle pressure on this side, just giving it a little bit more volume on that left side. Now that I've done that, I do feel like maybe this area in here can be just darkened just slightly. Trying to merge all of these subtleties together. This is a very subtle, elegant painting. So all of these edges are just thinking about the form. Sharp edges for abrupt changes and cast shadows. Sharp edges for where I'm seeing the end of one object. And in this case, it's mostly soft edges or relatively sharp edges that I'm keeping fairly soft. And I can always zoom out, double check my work. So that highlight that I put in here, it feels a bit strong. So if I compare this to this, it gets a little bit darker down in here. So I'm going to cover back over this, just taking my time. I'm patient to get it right. When I get these values right, they're going to start to really come together a lot more easily. I think this darker value can still be pushed in here. And this value, if I put it down on the right, I just think it's a little too dark. It's only that bright in just a few areas. So I think by darkening this, everything else will start to come together better. Very subtle work, but it's going to help. It's also a similar color now, more green. So that will help as well. Gonna go back to my smudging tool to make sure that the areas that I want soft are staying soft. The areas that I want sharp are staying relatively sharp. Constantly looking back to the reference for confirmation. Even willing to change my shapes if I feel like they've gotten a little bit off. Or the values. Now, some of these edges in here might look a little bit funny, and they almost look funny because they don't have anything above them to anchor them. So I will just put in some slightly brighter, more confident values. Gonna need to have some sharper edges in there as well. And these will just be some placeholders, but what they're gonna help do is just give some really stronger volume to the hair. So just slightly brighter values, but it's really what it is the sharper edges that's doing this. There's kind of this brown underneath as well, so I want to kind of capture some of that too while I'm at it. But even if I just kind of like scraggly drop in some of these values sharply, it's just going to bring the hair more to life. I should probably be doing this with more care and thought, but it's starting to just help I'm really looking down at that cast shadow that we've created with the ear and everything, just trying to help that make more sense. And I might be rushing this a little too much. Some of these are going to just require some sharper edges even of the darks as well. Strengthen the edge where the objects end, defining it. All of these edges in here, we have the sharp edge of the outer edge of the object, but we also have these soft edges that are transitioning. Those are, again, just form shadows. And it doesn't seem like much as I drop these in. Looks like I actually need to drop in a darker value instead. So I'll grab this value and kind of push this in. Maybe I think I'll get a more appropriate color, this darker brown. Can push this in here, put it in here. Just catching where those shadows are. Either they're there or they're about to be there. So laying those in, you can see this is starting to get a better sense of volume now. And then I can leave the top edges of these where I'm kind of defining this a little bit more. I can leave that area sharp because that's a change in plane. It's kind of like a cast shadow, but it's the other side over here. That's the form. And that's going to help give this volume. Wait, that was wrong. In here. And these might be really lumpy shapes, but they're still going to have a sense of form. Just going to put these in as well. Let's see, we actually have this, whoops, we've got the shadow of this that kind of comes up around here. So they're now doing this shape. And then I just want to soften them. But still keep sharp edges where they belong. So that's going to stay sharp. That would stay sharp. This would stay sharp. So that has a lot more form and volume now. It's going to be easier to establish this too. Just fading this out, focusing on the edge, not creating any lines. Can even, define some of these better by tucking into here a little bit more. And then a few little highlights. Don't need to go crazy. Could just start to drop them in. We have an edge out here, which you've captured, but it's not sharp. We can make the outer edge of it sharp, and then the inside edge we can keep that soft. But that's giving some dimension to the side of her head on that side. Okay, so I can keep working. Hopefully you're getting the idea. And we're just bringing this to life more and more defined and realistic, thinking about those form and cast shadows. Now, there are also edges to create depth. So notice how I didn't quite define the edge against the background here just yet. That's the end of an object. So usually we would just make it sharp, right? Just like how I made the edge of the frill sharp and those things. But as some of these edges are going further off into the distance, we want to start managing the edges more carefully and thoughtfully. So for instance, if we come back to the necklace, the necklace part that's right here is closest to us, and then back here it's soft. So when we think about that in those terms, it actually makes sense that over here, this would start to get softer, relatively speaking. And that's also why this kind of looks a little bit funny. So if I start to soften out, if it's gonna let me, what layer am I on? Oh, okay, looks like I have 2 layers here. So I'll just merge them together. Let me double check I didn't do anything crazy by doing that. No, we're good. Okay, so in here, if I kind of actually soften the back edge of this a little bit more, that's going to be creating some depth. So I'm not softening it because it's a turn in form, I'm just softening it because I want it to start to fall back. I can even leave this edge right here sharp and this side soft. That's, again, just communicating a sense of things falling back. It's a bit extreme, but it's working, so I'll just leave it alone. So I can let that be a little bit softer. Maybe this back edge in here, I don't want it to be razor sharp, so I just want to blend it out a little bit more smoothly, so it's kind of having a more elegant look to it. But maybe the edge on that cast shadow, maybe I could leave it, because that's an area of focus. There's a lot of attention going in there, so maybe I just leave that part alone. A lot of the areas in here, we might want to have some sharp edges, but maybe impressionistic, bold strokes. That keeps it in focus, but also a little bit loose and not defined. In here, we would definitely want to define things a little bit better, but maybe in the edges, like over here, we would want that to stay soft. At this neck, let's think about this neck receding and the chin. So the chin is going to be behind the neck, so the neck is going to be in front. So how do we communicate that? Well, let's make a sharper edge. So sharp edges are going to pull forward. So maybe I want to leave this area right here soft, but as I'm starting to create a relationship between the neck and the chin, I want to maybe strengthen that a little bit more. So now we're getting into a sharp edge here. And let me check the reference. So we do have a kind of a darker value peeking around. I think it's capturing just right when this is starting to turn and form. So that might be giving it some more volume, kind of like that beginning form shadow. And that's also defining the neck very nicely. And it drops deeply into shadow. So we'll grab this and I'll just establish this. Whoa, look at that, boom. And it kind of comes down in here. Just laying it in as I'm seeing it. We're going to need to soften some of those edges for the sake of the form, but it seems to be doing something kind of like that. It even kind of comes up here and then dips back down. Something like that. And it seems to come out a little bit this way. Okay, so just within this area, and we do have a darker, the background is getting a little bit darker against here. I had mentioned that earlier. So if I kind of just, some bigger strokes, just kind of darken some of this. Whoa, got a little bit too close there. Just trying to very gently darken some of this. Again, always trying to get the relationships nice and good. Okay. So we're going to want to eventually define that edge. And man, it really does get a lot darker over there. So I am going to push this a little bit further along. So I'm being careful about this shape. I'm doing this from a distance so that I can manage the overall shape of it all. Might be losing a little bit of information as I'm establishing this. I think I'll grab this darker value, which seems to be darker up in here. Okay, let's resume here. So the neck is in front, the chin is behind. So that would make sense to then kind of blur out some of this area, while even though there's a form shadow in here, we want it to be a little bit soft. It doesn't have to be as soft. So this could be more nondescript and more blurred, but we can keep it relatively sharp. So right there, it's sharp, and then right here, it's softer. That is all helping to create a greater sense of depth. And it's pretty cool because, you know, you can start to see these things in the painting in the way that the artist handled it himself. Where these edges are starting to get a little bit softer as they come out, but they're staying pretty sharp as they're closer to the neck. And I just want to reestablish this edge. I want this to really be darker as it's turning into the shadow, turning towards, turning away from the light once again. So darkening that there. Can kind of push it a little bit darker right on that turn in the cheek, which I'm seeing in the painting reference. That might be a little too strong. So I'll just back off a little bit. We seem to have more of a defined edge in here, but I need to get the right value. So even the face itself, like we think about this area in here is soft. It's a little bit sharper right here and a little bit sharper over here, and this is soft. That once again is helping contribute to depth, but it's not, this is not sharper than what's over here. So all these things are being specifically managed relative to each other. I hope that's a big takeaway from this, is that you're being specific as things relate to each other. It's sharper than this, but not sharper than that. It's darker than this, but not darker than that. It's more yellow than this, but not more yellow than that. That is specificity. And as you narrow it down more and more, just taking your time, always comparing relationships with each other, you're going to start really getting it to be more accurate. And I think I was kind of going a little bit off base there, so just reining myself back in. Still just feel like something is weird about these edges. I want them to be receding still. Maybe I just need to reinforce the background a little bit more as well. I want to reestablish the, you can see there's kind of this brighter value up in here. I just need that to be darker. It needs to be wrapping back. I don't want to create an outline of the background, which I feel like I am creating as I'm doing this, but I want that to be rolling back, so I'm just darkening that edge right there. There we go. So I hope this is making sense as I'm doing this. I'm just going to grab that dark value that we had earlier, which is there, but now we can establish it more strongly. Kind of swung up here and kind of jumped down there for this impression of an eyelash. Feels like it even was kind of coming up here too. Something along those lines. Okay, so yeah, this has been a long video, and but I hope this was really helpful in giving you some direction on how to manage your edges in particular as you're refining things, staying within certain parameters with your values, and constantly comparing one thing to another. Just giving you some sense of direction with how you work in your your paintings, and I could just keep tweaking this, but I'm always being careful to just stay within that overall impression that was originally established. It's an impression that you originally established yourself. And so, again, fantastic work in doing that and maintaining that, and just encouraging you on to push to that next level. You can do this in a way where it stays impressionistic, it doesn't get photorealistic, and still have this level of specificity in your work. So I hope this was helpful, and take care.